The starting point of this story was simply a cycling expedition that I was planning along the Heraclean Way, which is the path that the god Hercules is supposed to have taken all the way from the ends of the earth, or the sacred promontory, the extreme southwestern tip of Spain, across Gaul and through the Alps. He's supposed to have created the pass, the most convenient pass over the Alps, called the Mont Genève, which the Celts called Matrona. What I discovered, even before I had loaded up the bike panniers, was that a lot of places associated with Hercules lay not just on the Heraclean Way, but on a very precise trajectory which went from the ends of the earth all the way to the pass in the Alps that he'd created. And what struck me about this was that it was oriented on the rising sun of the summer solstice. Now this sounds a bit esoteric and vague, but in fact the solstice was a crucial means of measuring for the Celts and the Romans and the Etruscans. It's the time of year when the sun rises in almost exactly the same place for 7 to 10 days in a row. I knew that the Celts had aligned their tombs and some of their towns on the solstice, but I had no idea that they'd ever aligned anything that covered several thousand miles. And at the time it seemed completely impossible. That I thought this was beyond the capability of Iron Age people. But as I began to put the picture together, it became apparent that not only had they plotted the Heraclean Way with extreme precision, but also that there were other parallel Heraclean ways which they used to organise their settlements and tribal migrations and battles. So that was the beginning of it. And at the time it seemed as implausible as it sounds when I just describe it bluntly like this. And it took about 2 years to find out that it really was worth pursuing and that there really was a precise mathematical reality to it. In order to prove that this actually was real, I first of all had to try to disprove it. And I told a friend at the time that at the moment I'm just trying to disprove it, because actually that's the only way to protect yourself from the effects of excitement, because the more thrilling a theory is, the more you want it to be true. And in order to trust my findings, I had to do what a scientist would do with a theory, try to prove that it couldn't have happened. The next thing I tried to do was to prove to myself that the technological capability existed, that people in the Iron Age actually could have covered the continent with solstice lines and planned things on such a grand scale. And that took me into the whole world of Greek science and technology, which in fact was better known to the ancient Celts than it was to the Romans. And it turned out that actually the scientific capability did exist, and that not only did it exist, but the Celts were better able than the Greeks had been to put this into practice. Because whereas in Greece there were lone individual geniuses who developed the science behind all this, they were working on their own, and so their discoveries were largely theoretical. Whereas the Celts had trained scientists called Druids, positioned all over the continent, all over the Celtic world, who could collate their results and who could make the Greek science correspond to a reality. I think, like a lot of other people, I had assumed that the Druids were white-robed, fanatical priests who practiced human sacrifice and represented a very primitive form of religion. The more I looked into it, the more it became apparent that actually the Druids were the scientists and intellectuals of the Celts. In fact, they had the longest education system in the ancient world. If you went to Druid school as a boy or a girl, as a rich child or a poor child whose parents and relatives had clubbed together to provide them with a scholarship, you would expect to remain at Druid school for up to 20 years, which makes it the most comprehensive education in the ancient world. When you first look at the Druids, it looks as though there's almost nothing left. And in some ways, that's the exciting thing about ancient history, is that you do meet areas of total ignorance, and you have to accept the fact that some things are strange beyond recall. But curiously, the Druids were so good at preserving their wisdom in verse, in memorised verse, that a lot of it survived in Irish myth and Welsh myth. And once you start putting it together, you can come up with a fairly comprehensive picture of what a Druid actually was. One of the main sources is Greek travellers who wanted to write books about the ancient Celts. This is the 1st, 2nd centuries BC. And Julius Caesar, who almost destroyed Celtic civilization in Europe. And those writers were mercifully concise, and their words are packed with information. It doesn't really take that long to winkle it out. And you suddenly realise that we have a huge store of information about the Druids. And why has that been lost, or lost again? It's partly because of our preconceptions about the Druids, a lot of which come from the Romans. The obvious question is, why has no one thought of this before? I think there are several answers. Some of it was just pure chance. So I just happened to put different pieces of information together. I'd read about these mysterious places, which the Celts called Mediolanum, when I was working on the discovery of France. And it was about that time that I planned the journey along the Heraclean Way. And there was no way of knowing that these two things were connected. So I was just lucky in that conjunction of pieces of information. The main reason is that archaeology produces a huge amount of material every year. Archaeologists are notoriously bad about publishing the material, and recently there's just, especially in France, there's been a great bringing together of all this information that makes it a lot easier to do research on it. But I think the main thing is just having the time to spend to put this together, really, and taking a gamble that it might have been true. I think if I was a full-time academic, it would have been impossible, because I would have been working in several different fields. I wouldn't have been working in the field I was supposed to be working in. So a lot of it really was just time and being able to think about it, and just blind luck. Probably most of all, it's computer technology, because if you don't have computerized maps, imagine the space you need to work in to spread out all the maps, which you have to have on different scales in order to test these theories. It would be impossible. You'd need an office the size of an aircraft hangar and a huge team of trained assistants, which just wouldn't have been possible. So it's partly that. It's the conjunction of pieces of information, but also the sudden improvement in computerized cartography. My background was in literary history and textual analysis, and textual analysis is absolutely crucial for this. And the texts are Latin and Greek rather than French, which is what I was used to working in. But those skills are transferable, and in fact it's important to transfer those skills, to test them out in different disciplines. The experience I didn't have was practical archaeology. I had experience in purely amateur archaeology, which anyone can practice in France, because if you just root around almost anywhere in some parts of France, you will find ancient Roman pots and fragments and bits of brick and roof tile. And the same is true to some extent in Britain. And I was fortunate enough to be living in a place that's very rich in archaeology, so if you just went out to dig a trench for the endives or whatever you were planting, you were very likely to come across material from all kinds of different periods. So I think I felt I had a freedom that was unencumbered by the traditions of a particular academic discipline. I haven't found any resistance from archaeologists or ancient historians in particular, at least not those I know. I've always found archaeologists to be very open to new interpretations, because when an archaeologist is working on an ancient site, they're always telling stories to themselves, trying to piece the fragments together. And so I think archaeologists are often much more open than people in some other academic disciplines, certainly the one in which I used to work, to having new stories told about what they're finding. And one thing I wanted to show in the book was that this kind of apparently bizarre esoteric theory is worthless unless it's attached to the physical evidence. And archaeology, after all, is probably the greatest collective endeavour in the history of scholarship. And it's important, you can't just sweep that away and come up with a theory expecting it to stand up in ignorance of all that work. For me, the big departure in this book was writing about my home country, Britain. I'd almost never written about Britain before. I think I wrote about France so much because even though I'd lived there and worked there, it was an exotic country. It was abroad. I'm British, my parents are Scottish. I think what enabled me to write about Britain in this was that it was Iron Age Britain, so it was inevitably a remote and an exotic place. In fact, I had no idea I'd be writing about Britain when I started the book, because I shared the Roman prejudice that Britain was a misty, benighted place on the other side of the Oceanus Britannicus. I'd forgotten that almost a century passed between the Roman conquest of Gaul and the conquest of Britain, during which time, with the great exodus of Druids across the Channel, the system reached a new height of sophistication. And it was very exciting to be writing about Britain at last. One of the prejudices we share with the Romans concerns the identity of the Celts. Now, the Romans thought of the Celts as a race. You could be ethnically Celtic. And when I started working on the book, someone said, "Oh, you have dark hair and your parents are Scottish, so you must be a Celt." And when a German friend heard this, he said, no, you're not a Celt. And talked about our mutual friend who was very tall, blonde, blue-eyed Bavarian, said he's a typical Celt. There is still this idea that the Celts, there must be a Celtic DNA. The great strength of Celtic culture was that it was a culture, and that's why it spread so quickly and so far, even to Ireland. And there's no evidence that any Celtic group of people invaded Ireland or settled there in the Celtic period. And so the question to ask about the Irish is not where did they come from, but when did they become Celtic? Our conception of the Celts is shaped almost entirely by the Romans, and Asterix is a good example of that. He's the plucky Gallic resistance fighter who's a bit chaotic, but he's got a great sense of humour. And whereas the Romans are the Nazis, the super efficient Nazis who come marching into Gaul and make everyone miserable. And to some extent that is true. I mean, the Roman army was extremely efficient. They practiced tactical genocide. Caesar deliberately wiped out entire tribes or mutilated the male population so they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So there is some truth to that. There's also some truth to the image of the Celts as, like Asterix and his friends, being controlled by druggy, fanatical priests in white robes, because they did allow divination, religious divination, to determine their military tactics to a large extent. The real problem is that the archaeological evidence at first seems to support the idea of a rather primitive race in contrast to the Romans. And what we have to do is, when we imagine an Iron Age town, which is a little clutch of smoky thatched cottages, we also have to remember that somewhere among those smoky thatched cottages there was a blacksmith's forge which contained more advanced instruments than existed anywhere else in the world at the time. And the gleam of the blacksmith's forge was like the light from a laboratory. And they were producing art objects which are displayed in hundreds of museums, which are so microscopically precise and often produced by techniques that have been completely lost, that haven't been recreated, that then you start to realise there was a lot more to Celtic civilization than the Romans claimed. And it's only now that we're starting to see the patterns and mathematical ratios on which those art objects were based. To us, those swirling labyrinths look like something from a very ancient world, which they are, but they're also based on very precise mathematical reasoning. And the Druids, under whose supervision these objects were often produced, loved secrets. They loved not revealing the whole picture, but giving you just a fragment from which you can discover the much larger pattern that it belongs to. The idea the Celts had when they mapped the heavens onto the earth and produced these solstice lines and bisecting lines that they used to organise their towns was that you needed the ratification of the gods. You needed to make this earth, which was known as Middle Earth. It's a concept common to many mythologies, but especially Celtic mythology. Middle Earth has to be turned into an image of the upper world. There's something quite practical in this, because if you have hundreds of different tribes, all of whom have to be brought together in a military alliance or a monetary union, which they also devised, you have to make sure that everyone agrees. And there's only one authority everyone can agree with, and that's the ultimate authority in the sky, the sun, or the sun god. In that sense, this mapping of Middle Earth had an intensely practical purpose. It was also impractical because they based military strategy on it and asked the gods to dictate military policy, which is why Caesar had a relatively easy time of it when he defeated the Celts. I think the strangest thing of all, that sounds so irrational that it's hard to believe that it was put forward as a sensible plan, is that the destruction of your army isn't necessarily a bad thing if the gods will it. And that is effectively what Celtic armies quite often did. They would deliberately immure themselves in one place, thus giving the opposing general the chance to eradicate the enemy at one go. It's a form of mass sacrifice, which we know the Celts practiced. They usually used convicted criminals, but if there were no convicted criminals, they'd use the innocent. And in a sense, that's what Vercingetorix did, and later Caractacus in Britain, when they effectively sacrificed their armies to the Romans. It meant that even though you had lost on Middle Earth, the gods would have a very rich harvest. And you could say that it worked in the end. Celtic society did prosper, and in some ways more than Roman society. Roman historians now talk about the Roman Interlude instead of the Roman conquest, because we can now see that Celtic civilization that predates the Romans continued after the Romans had left. When I looked to see whether or not this magnificent system had ever been translated to Britain, at first I thought it hadn't. Nothing seemed to fit. Tribal towns weren't in the right position. And then I realised, of course, since it was based on the setting sun of the solstice, by the time you got to Britain, the sun would no longer be rising and setting in the right place, as it were. And so it meant that a new ratio had to be devised. The lines in Britain wouldn't follow the same ratio as the Gaulish lines. And once I realised that, the same kind of magic occurred. I mean, it was like finding the same mechanism still ticking, left over from the ancient world. And to my surprise, not only did it also work in Britain, but it also worked in a much more sophisticated way that in some ways was easier to detect, and there was much more evidence left of it. I had no idea that the early British legends, which said that the great roads of Britain, the 4 royal roads, had been built before the Romans. I had no idea that that would turn out to be literally true. And yet it is, and it's quite mathematically provable. That system also transferred itself to Ireland, but once again with a slight change. Now in Ireland the evidence is slightly sparser, but of a higher quality. We know what the major Royal Iron Age sites of Ireland were, and once again in Ireland there seems to be a different ratio in play, and a very particularly clever meridian which wasn't centred on due north, but which echoed the Irish legend of invaders coming from Iberia, with which the Irish Celts traded. And it's a magnificent, it's like a compass needle that contains a huge amount of historical information. It's a beautifully clever system. It produces a shape which is the shape of Iron Age Irish history. One of the potential pitfalls of working with this gloriously coherent system is that it seems to magically generate coincidences. I learnt to live with coincidences, which of course have to be tested. At one point, I examined one of the nodal points on the map in northern England, and when I zoomed in on the map of modern Britain, the word suddenly appeared on the screen, Camelot. I thought, in a split second. This is in some ways quite plausible because Dark Age kingdoms at the time of King Arthur were heirs of the older Iron Age kingdoms. But when I zoomed in further, it turned out Camelot was the name of a theme park which closed 2 years ago. So you do have to beware of dissociating this from archaeological and historical fact. But that's not to say that all the coincidences are meaningless. And sometimes what gives you an idea of the extreme remoteness of this age is what you now find on that site. Actually, one of these coincidences which seemed at first insignificant and which turned out to be insignificant was rather ironically appropriate, because one of the main intersections in southern England is just in the suburbs of what is now Milton Keynes. Ironically, Milton Keynes was planned in the 60s to have thoroughfares, and has thoroughfares, oriented on the solstice sun, Midsummer Boulevard, Avery Boulevard and Silbury Boulevard. So it's actually the only town still inhabited in England which is oriented on Celtic solstice lines. There's absolutely no way in which I could have described all the ramifications of this system in a single book, and I hope that people will explore for themselves. Once you're given the precise coordinates of the significant places, you can experiment, you can put this to the test yourself and discover things which I haven't noticed, because there's really no end to this system, or the possibilities that remain to be discovered. And actually it's fairly straightforward once you have the cartographic software and a map to work with all the coordinates. You can quite easily explore it for yourself, and hopefully also go and discover some of these sites on the ground, because without the actual physical reality, none of this would mean anything.